What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Today, I am joined by Dr. Jeremy Loenneke, an associate professor of exercise science at the University of Mississippi. Dr. Loenneke, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, Mike. Thanks for having me.
It is my pleasure, and I'm super excited to dive into these topics we have for discussion today. To provide a little bit of background before we get into the nitty-gritty details, we're going to be looking over a paper of yours covering the concept of resistance training frequency. This paper was titled Frequency, the Overlooked Resistance Training Variable for Inducing Muscle Hypertrophy, and this was published in 2016, correct?
Somewhere around there, 2016, 2017, I think.
And I find that to be somewhat fascinating. Perhaps you could kind of clue me in on the history of this topic. But in terms of training frequency, in recent times, there's been this fascination with the quality of our training volume and the concept of junk volume or wasted sets within the training session. And it seems to me that this potential for a ceiling for per session effective training volume has really caught fire within the past year or two, and this seems to be mostly a product of the modified German volume training studies, the Barbalho papers before they were retracted, more or less. But you and your research team kind of were looking at this in 2016 and wrote this fantastic paper kind of discussing this concept of quality volume. Was there anyone proposing these ideas before this paper in 2016, or would you say that you guys kind of almost pioneered this concept in a sense?
I don't know. I think that's hard to say. I think it'd be probably a stretch to say that we pioneered anything with that paper. I do think that we present some pretty good ideas in that paper. Some of them which may or may not pan out in reality. But yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting topic, and I think it's one that for a long time wasn't focused too much. You know, we would think about increasing the load, increase the number of sets, etc. And I think oftentimes we kind of didn't, kind of even think about the idea of training more frequently. And I think a lot of that has to do with this fear of overtraining per se. So I think that's probably a part of it early on.
Fantastic. And with that being said, could we just get into a general summary of this paper? So what kind of spurred the thought processes that, facilitated writing this paper, and then just kind of talk about the findings or the main hypothesis that you're proposing in it?
Sure. Yeah, I can't remember the genesis of this paper anymore. I would say a large portion of it came from this idea that, from the protein literature, right? So, in other words, there's some ideas presented that if you were to consume, let's say, 30 grams of protein, that would have a very similar protein synthetic response as it would if you were to consume 60 grams of protein in a given meal. So the idea there was to distribute the protein evenly throughout the day, so you can get these maximal stimulations of protein synthesis. So I think it was kind of that discussion kind of led us to this idea of, well, maybe we can do something very similar with frequency and resistance training. And there was some data that suggests that, if you in a young individual, if you go from 3 sets of exercise to 6 sets of exercise in a given session, that the synthetic response really isn't all that different. In our mind, that suggested that perhaps if we took 3 sets, maybe that maximized the response in a given exercise session, that if you took the other 3 sets and did it at a later time, that you could get 2 stimulations as opposed to just 1. So I think that's the idea. And I think it's an interesting concept. And I think if you couple it with the overall arching idea of adaptation with muscle is progressive overload. So how can we keep progressively overloading the muscle? Well, as I said earlier, you can increase the load. And when you first start working out, that's going to be fairly easy to do because you're going to get strong very quickly. But at some point, that's going to plateau. And I think it's going to be difficult to keep progressing by just increasing the load on the bar. And then you could do the next step, which is you could increase the number of sets that you're doing or increase the number of repetitions. That's the volume component. But I think that there comes a point where doing more within a given session doesn't give you any more. And that's where we said maybe the next step after that is to increase the frequency of training. Now, I think one of the things that probably needs to be said is I think that we have to understand that what's being discussed is concepts. So I think everybody, and myself included, for a long time was looking for, I want to know how many sets. So at what point does it become junk? At what point is it from 4 to 5 sets, or is it from 5 to 6 sets? So I think that's very difficult to know exactly at what point and where does that transition take place. But I think overall the concept would be at some point, is it 4 or 5 sets? Maybe that's going to give you a very similar response. Is doing 20 sets within a given session? Yeah, that's probably overkill. So I think it becomes difficult to know exactly where, but the idea is that at some point doing more doesn't give you more growth. It just delays your recovery. In which case we said, well, maybe, we can transition to training frequently or a little bit more frequently. But as we discussed in the paper, you can only do that so many times as well. Right. And then what do you do? And I think we have some ideas presented there as well. So I think it's a really nice paper. I think we have to be very cautious with some of the frequency argument, just because there's only so many times you can train in a given day. And a lot of it comes down to what is your ultimate goal and what kind of training do you like to do? I think that's one of the more important components that doesn't get discussed a lot.
Yeah, fantastic. You mentioned there the muscle protein synthetic response to resistance exercise, and it does seem clear that there's definitely too much. I think we're at a state with the literature where 15 to 20 sets in a single exercise session, we can be sure that some of those sets are definitely wasted. And while we might not know if 4 sets, all of those sets count, and then the 5th set is wasted, I feel like perhaps, hopefully we could kind of lock in on like a pretty decent range, at least to give maybe some sort of practical takeaway here. I know when I see the information put out by other researchers in the field, such as James Krieger, many are kind of proposing that probably somewhere in the range of 6 to 10 sets seems reasonable in a resistance exercise session. You mentioned the possibility of 3 sets maximizing the MPS response in a training session. Was that just kind of a general figure, or have you seen some research that might suggest that 3 could be sufficient and anything after that, it might count, it might not, but 3 is definitely enough to get a sufficient anabolic response?
Yeah, that was a paper. I think it's a paper by Kumar that showed that. I think it was the leg extension exercise. I think it's I'd probably put the figure in a given session, depending on what exercises you're doing. I'd probably recommend probably 3 to 4 sets to as many repetitions as you can do to failure, I guess. I don't find the other figure like outrageous either. I think, okay, that makes sense. I definitely think that would probably maximize it for sure. Is some of that wasted? I don't know. Perhaps, but I think that we have to think about what are the exercises that are being done. If you're doing a multi-joint movement, that might be different than if you're doing a single joint movement. There's a lot of things that a lot of unknowns. But I think if you were doing a single joint movement, and let's just say the quadriceps, and you wanted to maximize the response in a session, I think if you did 4 sets to failure, I'm pretty sure that would probably get pretty close, if not do it. I think that you said they recommend a little bit more. So let's say you do another exercise, another 4 sets, probably good. Is some of that wasted? Maybe, maybe not. But I think that you'd probably cover your bases for sure. And I don't think that that's an outrageous amount of exercise to do either. And again, as I said earlier, I think that we have to consider what do some people like to do. There's a lot of people I know that a lot of the sets that they do, I can't imagine they're doing anything beneficial for muscle growth, right? I mean, they leave the gym absolutely destroyed, right? Are a lot of those sets that they did wasted with respect to growth? Probably, but that's what they enjoy doing. That's what they like, that feeling when they leave, and that it keeps them motivated and inspired to keep training for the long term, right? So I think that has to be considered, because if you just train if all you're focusing on is I'm going to do the least I can do to get that maximal response, but you don't really enjoy it, you're probably not going to last very long. So in the sport or in training. So I think that you always have to kind of have a little bit of give and take when it comes to that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. And it's something we've kind of been discussing on the podcast to a degree within this whole fascination with training volume. I think the literature is becoming a little more clear on this in regards to the individual response to exercise. And it seems like when you utilize a higher relative effort per set, so if you train to failure, you probably can, generate the same response to a higher volume protocol that keeps a couple of reps in the tank. So with that being said, it's kind of like, well, which style of training do you prefer? Would you rather, do 4 sets and leave your soul on the gym floor, or would you rather do 9 to 10 sets and keep 2 to 3 reps in the tank on each set and maybe keep the rest periods a little bit shorter? Probably cancels each other out. It's just if you're going to do the latter, you just need to do a little bit more total work to make up for that lack of effort and maybe utilizing shorter rests.
Yeah, and I think that when we say to failure, some people will say, well, you don't have to train to failure. This study stopped 1 rep short. It's like, well, that's that's pretty much the same thing, right? I did 11 reps to failure, or I stopped at 10. Maybe to me that's pretty much the same. But I guess everybody thinks about it a little bit differently.
For sure. When we are looking at the amount of effective sets within a training session, we're discussing the MPS response here. Is that the primary tool we should be analyzing in this equation? Or can we look at things from a more practical metric, such as over 12 weeks, groups performing a different amount of sets per session, who grew more? I assume these variables would kind of correlate to a relative degree, but is the MPS response in a single session the best metric to utilize when looking at the effectiveness?
No, I don't. I think you'd want to look at what you said, growth, right?
Okay.
I think you definitely want to see, does it actually pan out into appreciable changes in muscle size? And I think that the synthetic response is important because it kind of gives you some rationale for why you're doing certain things. But to really put all of your eggs and say, it's because of this is how you should train. And I think that the people who do a lot of that literature would say you have to be very cautious with just looking at a snapshot synthetic rate. And I think if you're going to make claims about muscle growth, I think you need to provide some evidence that it actually matters long term. And I think that's where the frequency argument, to be fair, really doesn't stand. There's not a lot of there's a lot of really good ideas for why, but where is that data, that long term, that really shows that if I train at a super high frequency, that it's going to be better than if I train with a low frequency? And we make I think a pretty good argument that maybe it could, but I think that it's a stretch to say that there's a lot of good data that indicates that anything over 2 to 3 days per week is going to give you that much more or anything more. no matter how beautiful the concept actually is, you know.
For sure. When we are looking at this MPS response, it has become actually pretty trendy in recent times for at least in kind of like the natural bodybuilding community, the evidence-based community, to utilize high frequency or full body training. And the notion that is primarily put forth for this to demonstrate its efficacy is the MPS response, and that advanced lifters have this attenuated response, and MPS is only going to be elevated for 24 hours, and as such, we kind of need to, frequently train that muscle to bump things up repeatedly. But others have kind of mentioned that, whether you train with a low volume per session and do it more frequently, or a high volume per session and less frequently, the MPS response over the course of the week, when we kind of look at this graph, more or less equals out in that basically high volume in one session will keep the response elevated for longer. But based on what I'm seeing in your paper, I'm not sure if that's the case. Would it seem that just in general the response is attenuated, and that, regardless of the amount of volume, the spike just isn't going to be as long in advanced lifters?
Well, I think it's tough to know. Is all of that synthetic rate is that every time it's elevated? Does that mean that it's necessarily attributing to ultimate changes in muscle size? So I think that's where it becomes kind of difficult to know if you're not actually testing the change in muscle growth. So I'm on board with the idea that trained people perhaps have an attenuated response. It doesn't stay as elevated longer. So I think that's the idea behind the frequency. But does that mean training more frequently would be better than training less frequently? I think it would depend on what is high frequency and what is low frequency, right? I think that's the complicated thing with a lot of these discussions. It's two high frequency. It is relative to one. It's one high frequency. It is relative to nothing. So, and that's really where we're at in the frequency argument, because the difference between these groups is so small. So if you look at the high frequency literature overall, there are a couple studies that have recently come out that has a differential of 4, but many of these have two days per week versus 1. So that's very hard to test the idea of frequency when you have a differential of 1, right? So I still support the idea that going to the extremes of frequency probably isn't going to do too much, but I think that it's a difficult thing to study because the vast majority of the literature is 2 versus 1, 3 versus 1. So it's tough because it always has to be, what is high frequency to you? 20 times, are you doing 2 sessions per day every day? I mean, that's super high frequency, right? But I don't know, a little bit of tangent there, but I think it's just kind of a difficult thing to address. But when we think about, rationalizations with the synthetic rate, it makes sense, right? And you can compare those, but you have to do the chronic study. You need to show that it actually matters. And I think most people would agree with that.
I think this whole thing is pretty interesting because as we're kind of repeatedly touching on here, it's just, the mechanistic rationale seems to be solid, but we really just don't have the long-term trials, and we can't be completely sure about the value of the MPS response to each training session and what that does in the long term for muscle growth. But despite that, like I said, I really do feel like many in the evidence-based community are kind of like portraying this idea as like, well, yeah, like look at X, Y, and Z papers. Like this is clearly like a very good strategy for the advanced lifter. If you enjoy it, if it suits your schedule, this and that, it's probably the optimal approach to take. And the primary rationale for that is usually this MPS response, and it's just shorter lived in advanced lifters. So training more frequently makes more sense. And it's almost posited as if we have these long-term trials which demonstrate its efficacy, but as you're kind of pointing out, one, those papers aren't there, and two, we really can't be absolutely sure of the efficacy of just looking at the MPS response.
Yeah, and Brad Schoenfeld does have a meta-analysis on this where they do look at the literature, right? And they demonstrate that, yeah, there is a small benefit to training with a higher frequency, right? And we discussed that in the manuscript. But many of those studies aren't actually quantifying muscle size or doing gross estimates of lean mass. And I think we have to be careful with, it goes back to, well, what's high frequency? 2 days per week? So that's different than what a lot of people are doing, which is maybe 4 days per week, 3 or 4 days per week. So I am on board with higher frequency being important, but to a point, right? Just like volume's important to a point. And what is that point? Is the the holy grail.
Yeah, absolutely. When we're talking about this whole concept of frequency and basically making sure our sets count or that we're getting the most of each set, what immediately comes to my mind, and probably some listeners of the podcast, I like to think of us as the 1%, really fascinated with the nuances. And I think a lot of competitive bodybuilders tend to be, slightly robotic in nature, and they're chasing this unicorn of optimal. So they are really interested in these trivial details that could be the difference between winning a show and coming in second. I think the next step here is the concept of twice a day training, being that, if I train more frequently, I'm going to have more effective sets. Well, what if I, kick it up a notch and I train twice in one day? Maybe, for example, they have a pull session and they do their back movements in the morning, and they save their biceps for at night, thinking that, their curls will be more effective without, giving them a little bit of rest from the pulling work. Do we have any literature demonstrating the efficacy of twice a day training? For some reason, something that comes to mind, I feel like I've come across one paper in collegiate athletes, and it might have been like female volleyball players or something. I could be completely wrong though, but have you seen anything about this?
I'm not sure. I think that it's a good point though, because I think that if you're going to make an argument that, where you look at the exercise variables, frequency is one of them. Okay, so let's increase the frequency. Well, how do we do that? Do we train? Do we add another day in the week, or do we add another session in the day? So I'd be confident in saying that there's not an overwhelming amount of evidence one way or another. I'm sure there's probably some studies that have been done, none that I can think of off the top of my head. But related to that, there's still going to be a point where you can't increase the frequency anymore. If nothing else, just because you have to also live your life and probably work your job, enjoy your family, enjoy other things of your life. So I think that also has to be figured into the equation, and with the idea that if there's only so much that you're going to change, right, within a given time frame, and overall, I mean, you can't just infinitely just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So all of those things I think have to be kind of figured in. So one way to increase frequency is to double up. Another way is to, as you said earlier, train total body and increase the number of days you're training per week. But again, at some point, you're going to run out of the ability to increase frequency. So then what do you do? And we suggest the idea of then maybe almost putting yourself into a detraining state for a short period of time to kind of resensitize the muscle. And that's a beautiful idea that I really, really like. I don't know. I mean, there's evidence behind it for why it would potentially work, but nothing long term that says in humans it's going to work really, really well, right? But I think that was put forth with the idea that, okay, if I train 2 days per week, I can increase frequency by training 3 days per week, and then 4 days per week. Okay, well, then maybe I'll double up on some of the days. But then at some point, you're not going to be able to recover as well, and that's going to, hinder you rather than advance you. So that brought us to the next point of, well, what do you do in that case? That's where we put the idea forward that maybe you can induce some detraining to resensitize your muscle. And there's some animal data that suggests that could work, but nothing too in stone. I wouldn't die on that hill, so to speak.
You mentioned factoring in recovery there, and I think this brings up perhaps a more practical discussion. While it is theoretical, I think that, the experiences of many of, the biggest guys and guys who have been doing this for a while would say that an advanced lifter who is likely very strong, at least relative for them compared to where they started, would be able to disrupt homeostasis to a greater degree per set. So if we, take the example of doing 3 to 4 sets per session, and perhaps, that being a low frequency, allowing to be able to train a muscle group more times throughout the week. For that advanced lifter, maybe they're squatting, 400 pounds for sets of 10. 3 sets of 10 with 400 pounds is a pretty significant stimulus for that individual. And for that reason, I would expect there to be a great recovery toll compared to a novice who's maybe squatting 135 for sets of 10. And for that reason, on the surface, many might surmise that while on paper a high frequency approach might make sense for an advanced lifter, in practice it seems contraindicated, because how could you lift such heavy weights day in and day out for a muscle group? Doesn't that muscle group need more rest to recover from the disruption that was caused? What are your thoughts on this matter?
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and I've heard that argument put forth as well. I guess it would depend on what you were doing. In general, I would probably disagree with respect to the recovery. If you take a trained person, in general, they recover faster, in my mind, than somebody who's never done anything. But I do see what you're saying. If you're doing, heavy squats, that might take a little bit more recovery time than if you're doing some machine work. So I think that's where the conversation becomes a little bit difficult. But in my mind, the way I think about it, if we take an untrained person and we train them, they get pretty destroyed doing nothing. And that through if you think about the repeated bout effect, with continued training, the damage to the muscle, et cetera, is much less as you become trained. So and obviously there's caveats with that too, I'm aware, but in general, I don't really follow the thinking of, as I become more trained, my recovery becomes worse, or I need longer. I don't agree with that. But I could see in certain circumstances, if you're doing a really heavy squat workout, maybe you couldn't do it the next day, but there's plenty of other things that you probably could do on that muscle.
Yeah, great point. And of course, I think exercise selection is a major concern in this entire discussion. Many of those who are promoting this high frequency split, for those who are putting out the details of their program, you will see that, if they're training a muscle group 4 to 5 times per week, they're probably, if we are talking about the quads, they're probably doing like some heavy barbell squat, like 1 out of those 4 to 5 sessions. And then they might be doing like leg extensions twice and like a leg press or a hack squat. So even if the research does tend to point towards an advanced lifter being more able to recover from their training sessions, as you mentioned, it might be different if we're talking about certain movements compared to like a machine single joint movement. Right.
And with respect to I used to be one of these guys who, it's like squats, but it's like, if all you care about is muscle growth, who cares?
Yeah.
Right? There's no question that squats are a tremendous movement, but if it means you can't train as frequently, then maybe you don't have to do squats you can still train legs without doing squats. So I think that's one of the things you can think about. If your goal is to try and get the muscle as big as possible, then yeah, include squats. But if you're trying to work under the frequency kind of idea, and you don't feel like you can recover from that, then try to do some machines. It's still, the muscle still has to work. So I think that we have to also kind of try to get out of some of that mindset of if you're not squatting, you're not actually training legs. I did admittedly have that mindset for quite some time. It's a very kind of elitist way to think, but something that probably should be said.
Yeah, it is very elitist. Thankfully, I have been seeing a recent transition in our community. It seems like probably about like 5 years ago or so, power building was huge. Like all of the best natural bodybuilders were squatting, benching, and deadlifting. But that is kind of transitioned, and now you see people, their main quad movement will be some sort of hack squat or leg press, which I think for the purpose of simply bodybuilding, just trying to get a muscle big rather than being the best squatter,
Yeah.
that's probably the way to go, especially in this context of frequency. It's an unsustainable approach, I would say, incorporating all of those barbell multi-joint movements frequently and not having any, connective tissue deterioration in the process.
Yeah, the squats, benches, and deadlifts. So it's like all those are really great movements, but and if you're trying to do both sports, then it's very important that you do both. But yeah, I would agree. For bodybuilding, you don't have to necessarily. You could. There's
Mm-hmm.
plenty of people who do, but it doesn't have to be your centerpiece to where you have to do that every time you're going to the gym. Otherwise, you're not really technically training. I think that's yeah. I'm glad to see that we're moving away from that idea.
Absolutely. Before we kind of wrap up this part of the discussion on frequency and transition to BFR, I am curious if you've seen anything in the literature that would indicate some sort of floor or minimum amount of work that should be performed in a resistance exercise session to generate a sufficient anabolic response. So if we kind of have this notion that, 3 to 4 sets probably does do it and kind of maximize that response. Have you seen any studies that maybe compare 3 sets to one and maybe one set looks like it's just not enough to generate a sufficient response?
I think in a single joint movement, if you're looking at leg extension and bicep curl or something like that, my guess is one set is probably, you know, it's probably good enough, at least to amount something. If you do three, is it a little bit better in some cases? But I think one would do it. But I don't know of many people who actually only do, one set. So I think that in general, if you did three or four, probably good. But if you only did one, you're probably going to get something. I don't think you'd get nothing.
Yeah.
And in many cases, there is this idea that one might actually respond, kind of similar to three. But I think overall, you would, in general, suggest that higher volume, whatever that means, in this case, three versus one, is typically better, but not always. You can always find a couple things where it's like, hey, one was very similar to three. Um, there are those studies that exist, but if it was me, I'd say, one would probably do it. Two, probably a little bit better. Three or four is probably best. Anything over that, maybe you get a little bit more, maybe not. That's how I would kind of probably think about it.
I think that's a perfect way to kind of sum up our thoughts on this entire concept of training frequency and the number of effective sets per session. So diving into a topic that I would say you're most known for, potentially that, and maybe the strength and muscle relationship, which, maybe we'll save that for another podcast episode because that's a whole nother can of worms. But as a general background on BFR to get this discussion going, for someone who has done so much work in this area, and in the context of bodybuilders who are fascinated with the mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy, what are the different ways I can get my muscles to get bigger? There is this conversation about mechanical tension, muscle damage, metabolic stress, the role of each of these in muscle hypertrophy. Mechanical tension seems to, we all think that it is the primary driver, but we're not so sure about the role of these other mechanisms. Are they simply byproducts of effective training and they're going to happen and we can't really separate them, or are they something unique which is driving an entirely different stimulus, and as such we should try to prioritize those styles of training within our program? When it comes to BFR, there's this whole notion of metabolic stress, and for your research and what you're doing, would you say that the metabolite production from BFR training is generating something novel or unique compared to more traditional mechanical tension-based methods? Or would you say that it's just kind of a backdoor to mechanical tension and it's a way to induce sufficient fatigue to recruit those high threshold motor units? And at the end of the day, this is kind of just a strategy that allows you to use lighter loads and get the same effect. What's going on there?
Yeah. That was quite a question. Yeah, I think I'd agree with pretty much the last thing that you said. And I think I was very interested in the metabolites and the potential ability for them in and of themselves to do something very unique. In other words, maybe pulling those metabolites, maybe there's something unique about that that's very anabolic. That has nothing to do with making the muscle fatigue more. It has nothing to do with augmenting muscle activation, etc. And that might be the case, but I have not seen a lot of evidence to suggest that that's true. So I think that it's one of those nice ideas that I'm just not sure is true. I think that it most likely is probably related to augmenting muscle activation, and then turning on all those very familiar cascades that you see with normal training. So I don't know that there's too much I don't think there's probably some unique growth pathway that only occurs with blood flow restriction that doesn't occur with normal training. I think that the approach to the muscle activation is probably a little bit different between high load exercise and low load exercise. It's not probably, it certainly is different. But I think once the fiber itself is activated, I think all the mechanisms at the fiber level are probably pretty similar between high load exercise and low load exercise with blood flow restriction. So yeah, I think it comes down to in what ways can you activate the fiber for a sufficient duration of time to turn on all of those signal transduction pathways. So that would be my kind of statement at the moment.
Excellent. So if the mechanism or the pathway we're stimulating seems to be pretty similar to a more traditional protocol, have you seen anything about potentially BFR preferentially targeting type 1 fibers as opposed to type 2? I feel like there was a study in like elite powerlifters who were running like 2-week blocks of BFR and they saw some preferential growth of type 1, but this could be just a very specific population that their training was so specific to powerlifting that they saw this response, and it might not apply to a bodybuilder who's utilizing a variety of rep ranges.
Yes, agreed. I think that I would definitely agree with that. I think that's that series of studies was very unique, super high frequency training. If I'm remembering the correct study, but I don't think that it's targeting type 1 but not type 2. I think that there's evidence that suggests that it can affect both, and that's true of low load exercise even without blood flow restriction if you're taking it to failure at least. So I do think that you're going to cause adaptation in both type 1 and type 2 fibers.
Further trying to unravel some sort of mysticism within BFR, and it's not just similar to any other training approach except with lighter loads. I remember when this was first surfacing as a popular strategy that it was proposed that this didn't induce muscle damage, or at least it did so to a very small extent compared to traditional exercise. I remember seeing some people kind of putting forth that this would be a great way to increase your training frequency throughout the week because it more or less would facilitate recovery to a degree while generating a sufficient stimulus. But I mean, I've done BFR. I've messed myself up for days following from this protocol. So I'm not really sure if perhaps this whole notion of it not causing muscle damage was a byproduct of the original investigations always using the 30-15-15 15 protocol. I think I said that right. It's 4 sets in total. Yeah. And if that's changed since, or if it doesn't really induce muscle damage, but at least from a soreness perspective and what I've experienced, I know these variables aren't exactly a 1-to-1 correlation, but I feel like practically they're kind of close. But does BFR generate muscle damage to a significant degree?
Yeah, I think that I think that it depends on, as you just said, like what is muscle damage, right? I think that early on, and I still largely agree with this, that if we're doing low load exercise with blood flow restriction, does it induce muscle damage? If it does, it seems like it's pretty small. And if you look at the fiber itself, it doesn't appear that it appears that it's still structurally sound, right? If you look at prolonged decrements in torque, which is an indirect marker of damage, that it doesn't appear to be a whole lot going on with that either. So all those things point to, if there is damage, it's very small. Now, the one thing that is quite responsive is soreness. So it does induce high levels of soreness. Is that muscle damage? I don't know, right? I think that some people, it's one of the indirect markers. But one of the things that they typically say is, are there really pronounced elevations of blood proteins? In other words, or muscle proteins in the blood, rather. So if you look at CK, et cetera, that's supposed to be in the muscle, not in the blood, in high amounts. So if it is in the blood, then that means there's been some membrane rupture, right? So are there a lot of studies that show high pronounced levels of that? No. Are there a lot of studies that show, impaired range of motion? No. Are there a lot of studies that show prolonged decrements in torque? Some, not a lot. Are there studies that show soreness? Yeah, I think that's the most consistent one. So is that in and of itself muscle damage? I don't think so. Some people would. People love to bring this up because I mentioned this on a podcast several years ago. I don't know what soreness is, right? I don't know what it's one of the things that fascinates me, because when you exercise, you get sore, right? When you do the same exercise again, you get less sore. Why? Like, you do it one time, right? You get sore. You do the same thing, and this will be the second time you do it, you're less sore. That blows my mind. I don't know why that is. So I know we're getting off on a tangent now, but the bottom line is that I would say that blood flow restriction probably causes minimal damage, right? But I think you could probably make the same argument with high load exercise, that high load exercise that most people do, right? And that, most people are going in, they're doing well, maybe not most people who are listening to this, but if you go in and you do, 3 sets per muscle group, you might induce some damage if you're untrained, but it's not even remotely close to what you see with some of the high force eccentric muscle damage protocols that are done to try and study muscle damage. So I think that those are the things that we have to try and separate. So yeah, does it cause muscle damage? If it does, it's probably pretty small. Are there some people that it could really induce some damage on? Probably. That's true of normal training. But I still maintain that you might be able to recover from this a little bit faster, particularly if you've done it repeatedly, because you're going to become less sore. But if you're under the premise that soreness equals damage, then yes, blood flow restriction certainly does that. If that in and of itself is not enough for you, then maybe you can be a little bit more under the idea that it causes minimal to no damage, right? That in and of itself is not enough to equate to damage. But I guess the bottom line is the one thing that is 100% sure is it does cause soreness. There's no question. And I've felt it myself many times.
I'm very interested now to go down this rabbit hole of soreness and muscle damage. So I believe from in the research, when we're looking at muscle damage specifically, we are assessing changes in the muscle fiber. And then there are these indirect metrics which are somewhat correlated, maybe, maybe not. It's definitely not one-to-one. And as you mentioned, we're looking at things like torque, which I guess we could more or less practically equate to training performance. How is your performance in the next session, your ability to produce force? We're looking at creatine kinase in the blood. And with that being said, if we use soreness or muscle damage kind of as a way to gauge our training frequency, I think a lot of people, when starting a high frequency program, they might notice that they're pretty sore at first in the first week, and they might notice it feels difficult to train the same muscle 4 or 5 times, but this is going to subside with the repeated bout effect and as they adapt. If we look at soreness from a training perspective and your thoughts on how it equates with muscle damage, do you have a position on whether it is a bad or fine idea to train while sore? And based on your response to that, how do we factor in training performance? So if we say that soreness, it's fine to train with soreness, if your training performance is elevated from your prior session, then you're probably fine. But maybe if you're sore and your training performance is worse, that means you need more time to recover. Kind of a lot of ideas on this. I wasn't exactly planning on diving into soreness, but you just made so many interesting points that I would just like to get some more thoughts on this.
Sure. Is it okay to train sore? I would say yes, depending on how sore you are, right? If you can't do the movement, then maybe just take some time off and do something else. But I don't think I don't think you're gonna, if you train sore, I don't think that you're going to, not see adaptation, right? Yeah. I think that, and that's one of the things with some of the muscle damage studies. We've done one of them with traditional training, because one of the questions that I'm interested in, if you look at some of the muscle damage literature, they'll train somebody and then they study the time course. So let's damage them, so to speak, and then study them at 24, 48, 72 hours, right? And then maybe sometimes 96 hours. And then have them come back the next week and do the same thing and show the repeated bout effect, right? From one of the things that we did, it's a paper by Sam Buckner, is that's not how most people train. So most people will train, and then as they're recovering, they train again. As they're recovering, they train again. So we did that study. Everybody was fine. Everybody survived. But, we did see, this was traditional high-load exercise. We did see some decrements in torque that weren't completely recovered by the next bout. We didn't do it long-term to see ultimate adaptation and if that would be different. But yeah, I think it's a tough discussion, because we typically talk about those early studies on where they just, they train and then they look at the recovery and they come back a week later. But people are training more than one time per week. So I think that's where it becomes a little bit, a little bit kind of less clear. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense at this point, but
can we look at it practically from a performance standpoint? So if we're under this notion that if you're a little bit sore, to an extent where it doesn't affect your range of motion in the exercise, it doesn't make performing a movement unsafe, but you're a little bit sore from the prior session, and then you come in and your performance improves or is even the same as last session, it's probably fine. But if you're a little bit sore and your performance is worse, there's probably a good chance you just need a little bit more recovery and perhaps reorganize your training split.
Yeah, maybe, or I think that we have to get away from this idea that if I don't have the same performance every time, or maybe, that it's like sometimes you just have bad days, and it doesn't mean anything other than you don't have it for whatever reason. Maybe it is because you're a little bit sore. I wouldn't panic at that point. I would just keep training. If you get to where you have a few days in a row where your performance is absolutely terrible and the rest of your day isn't going so well, then maybe start backing off a little bit. But I think that some people get so meticulous where it's like I'm a kilo less than I was on Monday. I wonder, maybe I need to up my protein. Maybe I need to do this. Maybe I need to do. It's just I'm sure it's fine. Just keep training. But if it starts to see that chronic decline, then yeah, you need to be thinking about some things. But yeah, let's say it's not the same. I wouldn't be panicking unless, of course, you can't do the range of motion. Then maybe try and do something else. But I don't think it has to be this overly complex thing where we always seen these performance benefits. And it's the same thing with like elite sport. If you're an elite athlete and you're going into the playoffs, right, and your recovery is not 100%, are you not going to play? Right? It depends, right? If you're really, really deflated, maybe you won't. But if you're kind of there or maybe a little bit down, you're probably going to play. I think about it the same way with training.
I think those are some excellent points to consider, especially in the concept of, many people are unsure of when to take a deload, and they might see, oh, well, my performance from last week is down, so I need a deload the following week. But as you mentioned, there are many other points to consider. Was it just a specific day? Maybe it's just this muscle group. Maybe your bench press is down, but your 3 other sessions and your squats and deadlifts are up from last week. Wouldn't really say that you need a deload the following week. But if you notice, this entire week, every session was bad, and there's no lifestyle factors which would explain those, then maybe it's time to start considering a deload. But we need to prioritize these long-term trends rather than the day-to-day per se. Is your performance improving in the long term? Is it long-term performance decrement, or is it just this one session or this one specific lift? And those should be evaluated to dictate your decisions, not the one session. And did I get better from last week? Because I need to improve every single week, or else I'm not growing any muscle at all.
Right. Yeah. And but to get back to the original point too, is like, if you are so sore that you are very limited in what you can do, then yeah, back off. There's no question. Maybe try to do something else, or take a walk, or just even walk around the block, right? Something. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily think that, okay, I'm a little bit sore, my performance is down, maybe I should not train today. I think you might be fine. I mean, you could not train, that would be fine as well, but I don't think it's gonna hurt you long term.
Absolutely. All right, Dr. Loenneke, that's all I got for you today. Really appreciate the time. I thought this discussion was extremely thought-provoking, a lot of interesting points for everyone to consider. I know the listeners are going to get a lot out of this podcast, because I know I did. For people who aren't already supporting you and would like to learn more about you, where should they go?
Twitter is probably the best place to communicate with me, at JP Loenneke, just my last name. I share a lot of my lab's work. So me with all of my students who generate a lot of these great ideas and a lot of great discussions. So I am indebted to them for sure. My current students, former students, but I share all of our stuff on Twitter as well as Instagram and Facebook. But I'm not all that interactive on anything other than Twitter. Instagram is impossible for me. Until they come out with the ability to type on a keyboard, I'm just going to be limited in my ability to respond. It just, nothing about that format makes sense to me. You can't share links. No. It's just weird. But I'm on there, and Facebook as well. But Twitter is probably the best place.
Cool. And I will link those in the show notes. Everyone, that does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.